Good afternoon. Welcome, dear friends, colleagues. My name is David Nuremberg. I'm the interim dean of the Divinity School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to this celebration of the career of our dear colleague, teacher, and friend, Wendy Doniger. Those of you who were present the day before yesterday at the celebration of Paul Mendes' Floor heard me speak already of the challenges before me as organizer. How does one celebrate the career of a giant? What form of recognition could possibly be adequate to the object? In Wendy's case, what can one offer a scholar who has written about everything, even as my son has noted, Harry Potter, a teacher who has nourished a generation and built a field, a person who has lived so many lives and had so many experiences? What can one possibly offer Wendy who already has everything? The answer, turns out, is obvious. One gives her a lecture by another giant, another polymath, another builder of field and liver of multiple lives. You give her a lecture by David Shulman. David Shulman is no stranger to our halls, so he really does need no introduction. I'm going to give him one anyway, but a short one so that we can hear primarily his words. He's a regular member of this community. The Renee Professor of Humanistic Studies in the Department of Comparative Religion at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is an Indologist, a historian of religion, an anthropologist, a poet, a peace activist, and I could multiply nouns. He studies the languages, literatures, and cultures of India, among other things. His work casts a wide net. He's explored the expressive power of riddles, the history of religion in South India, classical Indian poetry, love stories, theater, and much more. You can already see parallels with our honoree. He's the author, editor, or co-author of over 30 works, including Tamil temple myths, sacrifice and divine marriage in the Indian Shaiva tradition, The King and the Clown in South Indian myth and poetry, The Hungry God, Hindu tales of filicide and devotion, and The Wisdom of the Poets, studies in Tamil, Telugu, and Sanskrit. And recent works include a travelogue, Spring, Heat, Rains, a South Indian diary, A History of the Imagination, More Than Real, A History of the Imagination in South India, and a cultural history, or let's say a biography of a world language. I shouldn't say let's say, he says Tamil, a biography, which is a splendid book. Well, they're all splendid books, but this is the most recent one I read. He's also well known for his peace activism, particularly as an advocate for the rights of Palestinian civilians. He's a founding member of Ta'ayush, Arabic for living together, an all-volunteer organization working towards, quote, a future of equality, justice, and peace through concrete, daily, nonviolent actions of solidarity to end the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories and to achieve full civil equality for all. And as someone who has seen his photographs from the front on a regular basis, he puts his body on the line for this cause. He chronicled his early work with that movement in his 2007 book, published by the University of Chicago Press, that's a plug, Dark Hope, Working for Peace in Israel and Palestine, and in his latest book, Freedom and Despair, Notes from the South Hebron Hills, published just last month, also by Chicago. He's been a MacArthur Fellow, a member of the Israeli Academy of Sciences, of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a winner of the Emmett Prize, of the Israel Prize, which is the State of Israel's highest cultural honor, and many, many other honors. I hope you can see why Professor Shulman is the perfect person to celebrate the career of his longtime friend and colleague, Wendy Doniger. Today, he will speak about Candrarekha's Lament, a not-so-lovely courtesan, a bittersweet poet, and a very little king. Please join me in welcoming Professor David Shulman.
Thank you very much, David. I'm very moved and also honored to have been invited to give this lecture in honor of an event that I think one would have to describe as a kind of mythic or cosmic event. I mean, Wendy Doniger is actually retiring? Will the rivers continue to flow into the ocean? Will the mountains still stand? Will the stars move in their courses to the sky? It's not really clear that that could be the case. I have to say, first of all, Wendy and I have been friends, close friends, believe it or not, for nearly half a century. We met, actually to be precise, it's 46 years. We met in the autumn of 1972 at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, where I was a beginning PhD student, and Wendy was teaching a course in Indian history. I thought I should tell you a little bit about this first meeting before we get into the actual lecture. Wendy's course, I was in the India department, and Wendy's course in Indian history was mandatory for all students in the department, so I went to that course. So you have to understand that I was coming from a BA at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in Islamic studies and Arabic. In those years, and possibly still true, Islamic history was taught in Jerusalem in a kind of very grim and highly hyper-positivistic way. It was also, in its own way, a very amazing example of a Saidian Orientalism. In fact, possibly the only example, a real example of Saidian Orientalism. So that was my training. And when I arrived in London and went to Wendy's first class, what can I say? The tone was a little different. This was a kind of rollicking, rambunctious, exuberant romp through all of Indian history. And I was initially sort of taken aback by it, and I was also a little irritated by it. So then something happened. It was in the second class, I believe. I was sitting way in the back of the classroom, and Wendy was talking about something. This was the beginning of the semester, so it must have been something about the Indus Valley or the Veda, I don't know. And she was somehow reminded of the story. There's a story about the Arab conqueror of Egypt, Amr ibn al-As, and the Library of Alexandria. There's this famous library in Alexandria. So the story is that when Amr ibn al-As came to Alexandria, and they said, there's this great library here, he said, well, burn it down, because all the books in it that agree with the Quran are redundant, and all the rest of them are heretical. That's the story. I happen to know that actually the library had burnt down several times before the Arabs ever got there. In fact, most famously in the early 3rd century, so some 400 years before Muhammad. And when Wendy narrated this story as if it were just God's truth, I, without thinking, rather rudely, yelled out from the back of the room, "That's a myth," I said. Not realizing that by choosing that term, I was actually elevating and dignifying the story to a tremendous degree. There are stories, and then there are myths, which are kind of super stories that speak truth infinitely more interesting than a mere historical fact. But still, I was I was unnerved by this, especially by my own kind of blurting out this thing, and I was afraid I might have offended Wendy. But then the next week, I came into class. Before class, Wendy entered the classroom and she rushed over to me and she said, "I've been hearing about you from all my Israeli friends in Oxford." In those days, there were a lot of Israelis at Oxford. And she said, "I'm so glad that you're here and that you're in this class. Let's become friends." And indeed, that's what happened. And that was the first example that I had of Wendy's amazing magnanimity of spirit. I had at that time only the very beginning of an inkling of how great a blessing it was that this friendship existed, and very rapidly it proved itself to be enormously important, also sometimes in practical ways. Just to give a simple example, a year later I had to formulate a research proposal for my PhD. Wendy had just published her first book, Asceticism and Eroticism in the Mythology of Shiva. It was an amazing book, by the way, revolutionary book at that time, because everybody who had written about Puranas until Wendy had written in this rather dry, dull, desiccated way. And suddenly here was a book full of life. That was the heyday of the influence of Levi-Straussian analysis in the English academe. And because I had begun to move in the direction of looking at the Tamil Sthala Puranas, these local compilations of temple myths, and I'd also been reading Levi-Strauss, and I'd also been reading Wendy's book, so I thought, well, obviously the thing to do is to write some kind of Levi-Straussian analysis of these myths. So I went up to Oxford to talk to Wendy about this, and Wendy, God bless her, said to me, she said, oh, no, you don't, just leave that Levi-Straussian thing aside. Actually, I have to say, that wonderful book, her first book, has long outlived the usefulness of Levi-Straussian's methodology. She said, don't even think about doing that. You have this enormous corpus in Tamil. Just read it and tell us what's different about it. And, that was a very simple but incredibly helpful, actually revolutionary piece of advice. Changed my life. That was only the first time that Wendy said something that changed my life. I just want to say one other short little thing, a little vignette. When Wendy came to Jerusalem the first time, it was Passover, and the day before the Seder, she said to me that she wanted to learn a little bit of Hebrew. So I said, oh, that's fine. So there's the word for yes, ken, and then there's the word for no. And she stopped me in the middle of that sentence. She says, don't bother teaching me that word. I'll never use it. And that little sentence, I think, encapsulates something about who Wendy is. It's not just a simple statement. Really, it, I think, contains within it this astonishing joyfulness and celebration of everything that life brings to us, the joys of being alive, of being a human being, of having a human heart, of having a human body, the joyfulness of some God who she may not even believe in. Actually, it's an amazing word, the word yes, when spoken by somebody like Wendy. Wendy, I don't know how to thank you. The only way I could possibly thank you, I suppose, is to tell you a good story. So that's what we're going to do now. Let's begin. So I'm going to be talking about a Telugu book from the early 18th century. There's a story, actually there's several stories about this book. I'm going to have to tell you how I got a copy of it. It's a very rare book. Before that, let me just say, you have a handout, right? Everybody has a handout. The names, the Telugu names, are all there for you. So this is a book which is called Candrarekha Vilapamu, the Lament of Candrarekha. Candrarekha was a courtesan, a Vaishya. I mean, to call her that is to somewhat dignify the profession that was her profession, as you will hear in a moment. The book has a hero, and that is the lover of this courtesan. He was a little king in a place called Yetikopaka in the northern Andhra coast, a really small little kingdom, probably no more than a few square kilometers. His name was Niladri Raju, the Blue Mountain King. That's how I'll be referring to him. And the poet who wrote this book is a well-known poet. His name is Kuchimanchi Jagakavi. He and his brother, Kuchimanchi Timmakavi, there were these two brothers, both of them were poets, very prolific poets. And they, both of them, did what poets did in the 18th century in the Godavari Delta, that is, they wandered from one possible patron to another, looking for somebody who would support their work. Same thing applies to musicians and to painters, by the way. So they came, the Jagakavi actually came to this Niladri Raju, Blue Mountain King, And in just a moment, I will tell you how the tradition understands that meeting and what happened before we actually get into reading bits and pieces of the work. I have to tell you in advance that this book is classed by its author as what is called Bhutu Kavya, that is an obscene Kavya. Actually, I have to say, of all Telugu books that I have known, I had to think this was the one that might possibly be the most interesting to Wendy. But you can also imagine that it created a slight quandary for me, because there are things that are said in the Telugu text that I think have perhaps never been heard in the august hall. I was wondering if the angels might fall from their position. I hope not. I've done my best. There are, I should tell you in advance, this is a story that has a happy ending. You'll be happy to know I'll be reading to you a bit from that ending. But along the way, there are a few moments that are perhaps slightly shocking. I toyed with the idea of using the venerable Indological convention of translating any sexually laden term in the original into Latin. That's how it used to be done. My Latin isn't very good anymore, and I also thought that was perhaps a somewhat cowardly way to go about this, so I've done the best I can, and I hope you'll bear with me, keeping in mind that happy ending that is waiting for us. Now, I want to tell you something about how I happened to get a copy of this book, because this is sort of part of the whole story. So I was in Kakinada, in the Godavari area, about 1.5 years ago. One morning, a good friend of mine, Karri Ramachandra Reddy, is a connoisseur of Telugu poetry, a teacher of Telugu poetry. He came to me and he said, let's go to Candrarekha. Candrarekha is a little village on the northern outskirts of Kakinada. I said, what's in Candrarekha? He said, well, that's the village where the Kuchimanchi poets, Jagakavi and Timakavi, were born and grew up. He said, let's go and see if anybody even remembers them there, So off we went on his motorbike. When we got to Candrarekha, came to the center of the village, beautiful, dusty Andhra village, like I like them. There were a few of the elders of the village kind of milling around the tree in the village square. And so we introduced ourselves and asked them, we said to them, do you happen to have heard of the Kuchimanchi poets? Does that name mean anything to you? And they said, oh yeah, we know that many generations ago there were 2 poets from this family in the village. And we said, well, do you possibly have any of their works? They said, oh no, there's nothing left of that. And then we said, well, is there anybody left from the family? They said, no, they've been gone for generations. But then they said, actually, on second thought, there is one old man, a retired schoolmaster. He lives somewhere just past the northern outskirts of this village. We don't even know exactly where, but if you go there and you ask around, maybe people will direct you to the house. So we tried that, and indeed, people, directed us one after another, and finally, somebody pointed out to us a house that was very deep in the paddy fields, isolated. And they said, that's the house of this man. So we made our way to this house, knocked on the door. A very old man arrived. Opened the door. We explained who we are, and we asked him about the Kuchimanchi family. Oh, he said, I am a descendant of those great poets. So we said to him, is it possible that you have any of their works? He said, give me just a moment. And he climbed up to some upper space in the house and came back after about 10 minutes and handed us a copy of the very first print edition of the book that I'm going to be talking about now. That is to say, the Candrarekha Vilapamu, Candrarekha's Lament. And the importance of this is that when the book was published, officially published, this was during the colonial period, so the British censors, true to their kind of prudish nature, they simply deleted about 1/3 of it. If if you open the print editions, the standard print editions, you'll see that most of them are these little dots where verses and prose passages once were, But it turned out that when the book was first on the verge of going into print, there were privately printed copies of it by subscription only, a kind of samizdat form of this book, of the original unexpurgated text, and they were published either in Pondicherry or in Yanam. These were two French colonies where British censorship laws did not apply. Yanam's not very far from Kakinada, it's just down the road actually. But it was possible to publish and to distribute secretly to subscribers an authentic copy of the book in its original form. And that's what this man handed over to us. He was happy to let us take a picture of it, photograph it, photostat it, scan it, and that's why I'm able to talk to you about it today. Now, there's a story about this book. Let me begin with the story. I'm going to tell you the story. Afterwards, we're going to read a little bit of the introductory section of the book. After that, we're going to go very, very quickly through the central section of it, and then I will read you a bit of that ending that I've already mentioned, and then I'll have a few words to say about why I think this particular text is so important, actually unique. So the story that the Telugu tradition has about this book, even though the book itself had more or less disappeared from sight, the story that they say is that the poet, Jagakavi, he went to Blue Mountain King and told him that he would be happy to compose a book in his honor. And the king, this little puny king, he said, "Oh, that's very nice." He said, "Please compose a Sringara Kavya," that is to say, a romantic love poem about me and my beloved courtesan, concubine, Candrarekha. Her name, by the way, means Sliver of the Moon. I'm going to be calling her Sliver. Compose a beautiful romantic poem about me and Sliver. So the poet happily went off to start composing the book, and he even gave it a title. He called it the Candrarekha Vilasamu, which means something like the ecstasy of Candrarekha. But meanwhile, a Sanskrit Pandit poet turned up at the court. His name, he's a historical figure, we know this man. His name was Adimala Venkata Shastri. You have it on your handout. So Venkata Shastri said to him, I'd be only too happy to compose a poem for you in the Sringara romantic mode in Sanskrit. And so the king immediately lost all interest in the Telugu poem. This is Shelley Pollock territory, the vernacularization and the enormous prestige of Sanskrit and so on. The king lost interest in the Telugu poem. The poet heard about this, and in a rage, he tore up his initial composition, Candrarekha's Ecstasy, and rewrote the whole text as Candrarekha's Lament. Then the story goes that he was wandering around Andhra. He came to Hyderabad and he had an audience with the Nizam of Hyderabad, that is to say the Mughal appointed ruler of Hyderabad, and he demonstrated his poetic prowess as poets used to do. And the Hyderabadi Nizam, who was called the Turkaraja, a Turkish king, Muslim king, he was very impressed, and he issued a farmana, that is to say a royal order, that this poem, Candrarekha's Lament, would be publicly performed in the court of somebody called Vijaya Ramaraju, who was the king of Vijayanagaram, not the big empire of Vijayanagaram. This is the northern Andhra city of Vijayanagaram. And this was also actually a very famous person, Vijaya Ramaraju. And not only that, it had to be publicly performed at the court, but in the presence of Blue Mountain King. And you'll see in just a moment why that could have been slightly embarrassing. As I told you already, this is an obscene text. And just to add to that, I might mention that this Vijaya Ramaraju, the king of Vijayanagaram, and Blue Mountain King, they were brothers-in-law. So everything that happened here, and it was a fairly loaded situation, happened within the confines of a single extended family. That's the story. It's actually possible that this story could be true. It's one way to explain the existence of this very odd text. It's possible that the poet composed a pornographic satirical work out of pique at being denied his usual fee. But actually, I have my doubts about that. You'll see in a minute how the poet himself presents the conditions and the circumstances of his composition. Generally speaking, however, in South India, it's very usual for a text, especially an important text, to have had a lost original. In fact, that's one way that one knows that a text is important, or even probably canonical. It has to have had a lost original, which has been maybe partly recovered in some way or another. And this particular story seems to fit into that pattern. And in fact, I think that, I'm going to tell you in advance, I think that the poem as we have it was composed on purpose in its present form by a poet who was trying to do something very unusual. I think something has changed in the literary economy or ecology of early 18th century Andhra. Okay, so now we're going to spend a few moments with the introductory section of this text as we have it. I'm going to be reading to you from my translations of this Telugu poetry. It opens with a benediction, as is conventional. Actually, you have it on your handout. It's the only verse that I allowed to be printed on the handout. It's a prayer to Shiva. Shri Kanta, black-necked Shiva, adorned by snakes, or the adornment of all lovers, Pujanga Bhushanundu. The very love God himself, though he himself had reduced desire to ashes, the God who taught an unforgettable lesson to the demons of the triple city, the God whose flaming hair is flying in the sky, Rudra with his trident, may he look upon Chintalapati Niladri with all three of his eyes. Well, that might sound like a nice blessing, but you have to remember Shiva has his third eye is here in the middle of his forehead. It's closed almost all the time, fortunately, because if he opens it, it burns whatever it sees to ashes. So that's the invocation verse. That's the blessing that the poet has to offer this patron, or almost matron. And as if that's not enough, there are a series of further prayers, one to Durga, who drank up the blood of the buffalo demon. May she make this ill-mannered king poor. And may the man lion, another bloodthirsty incarnation, absorb all his riches and pride. And may malevolent planets moving backwards destroy him, and so on. Sounds pretty serious. And then there comes the moment when, as conventional in Telugu Kavya, a moment where the wonderful benevolent poets of the past, Sukavis, are mentioned. And indeed, the poet mentions several. Bhima Kavi, Ramalinga Kavi, the great Srinatha, there's another Ramakavi, Turaga Ramakavi. All these poets are famous, above all, for their ability to utter effective curses against anyone who disappointed them. And then, finally, the hero appears. So it's, again, very conventional at the opening of a Telugu Prabandha Kavya like this, that you see the patron sitting in his court. And the patron, almost invariably, asks the poet who is writing this, documenting this, he asks him to produce a poetic work. So here's how we meet the Blue Mountain King. Are you ready for this? He proudly bears as his ornaments and jewels the scars and wounds he got from venereal diseases he picked up from the courtesans he so lavishly entertains. One day, the poet, that's how he says, he came to Blue Mountain's court in Kopaka village, where the king was sitting in state, except actually, to be precise, he was lying down on his throne with his head in the lap of Sliver. Remember her? And there are many courtiers, hunters with their 10,000 hunting dogs who love to lick the king's mouth and bark. That's for Wendy, too. And there were many low-caste bards and Muslims reeking of liquor, and Vaishya courtesans, Varastrilu, who were dancing. They too have venereal blisters all over their bodies, and many other servants who also double as pimps. And the king somehow manages to catch sight of the poet who has just entered, He's lying down. Anyway, he somehow sits up a little, I guess. He welcomes him warmly. And I'm going to give you just a short selection of the compliments the king showers on Jagakavi. But I have to remind you that these are verses that were composed by the poet himself. He's describing himself. There's no false modesty in the opening of a Telugu poem. "Oh, it's you, Jagakavi," said the king to me, the full moon rising over the ocean of the Kuchimanchi family, the one with this commanding expertise in Andhra grammar and poetics, with a mind full of poetry obtained by the blessings of Lord Jagannatha. "I'm so glad to see you," he said. "You're the one who composed the poem called Janaki's Wedding, and another great work in Dvipada verses on Krishna and Radha, to say nothing of all the Chatu verses and Shatakas, and Subhadra's nuptials with 22 outstanding long descriptive passages, Gadya, prose passages. That's a lot, 22. You have perfect pitch and good taste when it comes to Telugu. Lots of kings have honored you, whose tongue could adequately describe you. And furthermore, among the millions of poets on this sea-girt earth, you're the one who is most full, most perfect, the one who knows how to make books in the many styles of obscenity. Butularitulu. That's the important point. You can curse and kill long-winded fools. You're a rascal, full of manly fortitude. If someone were to celebrate you and your undoubted abilities, you would receive gold ornaments, garments, elephants, banners, fans, cows, horses, vessels of amazing colors, and the good fortune of a fine home filled with many wondrous things, such as sons and beautiful royal wives. Those are the things that the poet wanted to receive. You're as generous as Karna, the epic hero, with impeccable valor, eloquent as the great snake, Adishesha. You're overflowing with compassion for whoever seeks you out. Your mind is firm. You're destined to live long. Your fame wide as ambrosia, O great poet Jagga, rich in fortune. So, this humble, far from humble, self-portrait has some striking features. Notice that the king knows by heart the poet's list of publications. But for our purposes, the main thing is that phrase about knowing the many styles of obscenity. Because we have to take a moment, I suppose, to look at this word, butulu. It's a technical word, and also a general word for inappropriate language, like Sanskrit ashlila. Actually, these two words are connected. The Brown Telugu Dictionary gives us its meanings: foul language, obscenity, also slang, also nonsense. And the Surya Rayandra Nigantavas, the greatest of all Telugu dictionaries, it lists kutsitaputitu, that is to say reprehensible curses, and asatyamu, lies. And it's also a word for bhaktu, a bard who lives by praising others. A person who speaks bhutu is someone who curses untruly, asatyamuga. That's an interesting category in its own right. Some curses perhaps are not true. That is, perhaps they're not meant to carry the consequences they seem to suggest. And the link with the Sanskrit term ashlila means also that bhutu means coarse or vulgar language and also rustic speech. It turns out that for our poet, and perhaps generally in Telugu, composing bhutu verses, or in our case an entire bhutu text, is a special skill that only certain kinds of poets have. What kind of poets? Well, clearly those capable of uttering effective curses, titu, that produce results in the real world. Both Telugu and Tamil have a branch of literature that fits this definition, titu kavya. A poet should, in principle, know the science of combining sounds in such a way that they work either for blessing or for curse. That's the poet's true business. But actually the term is wider than the simple meaning of obscenity. You can see that. I think that we have to make room in discussing our text for the magical aspect inherent in this word. Bhutu may not mean only what it mostly means. It can also mean nonsense. And so we might ask, what is the status of a work that takes a whore and her lover as its heroes, and that portrays them in lyrical but grossly realistic ways? That's the question I want to address. So far, so good. Blue Mountain King has some not so good news for the poet he has just lavishly praised. By the way, says the king, Venkata Shastri, he's that Brahmin scholar poet, he's composed a work in the God's language, Sanskrit, on poetics. Alankara Grantamokati. Actually, we know this work. This is a book that has a name, the Alankara Sudha Sindhu. And in fact, this same Venkata Shastri was well known in the early 18th century. They called him Bala Kalidasa, young Kalidasa, reborn Kalidasa, the greatest of all Sanskrit poets. So the king is speaking. You should do this book into Telugu and dedicate it to us. It's true that I had asked you to make a good poem, and you have done this with verve. But there's a slight problem. I don't have the money to pay for it. If you ask me why this happened, listen. Some people had a grudge and complained about me to Vijayarama Raja, that's his brother-in-law. And he fined me 12,000 rupees. I went to Ichapuram and slept with a whore, and while I was sleeping, thieves entered the encampment and made off with horses and silver ornaments worth 10,000 varahas. A king just like me stole from me, too. In short, my luck has run out. I don't have the stuff to pay for a good book. And besides, listen carefully, and besides, earlier kings without number commissioned good books. And what came of it? They're all gone. No one even remembers their names. It was a huge waste of money. Disgrace and fame, apakirti and kirti, are there in this world. Undying fame costs a lot. Do me a favor. Compose a book for me. Compose it fast. And compose it for free. Upakaramuga. He was a cheapskate, Blue Mountain King. Make it funny. Hasya rasamuga. Something no one has ever heard before. That will make me and Candrarekha, that heap of graces, very happy. She used to be called Gangi, also Bringi. Her stage name is Sarangi. I myself became an expert lover by screwing her mother. Now don't cluck in disapproval just because she's a courtesan, Varakanyaka. That fellow Venkata Shastri made me fall in love with her because he too was very interested in her mother. He joined the two of us together at the time of a great ritual while all the pleasure women, Hogamuvaru, came and watched. Since she was like a daughter to him, he's connected to the mother, right? Since she was like a daughter to him, he taught her all the 84 arts of lovemaking, and he planted the arrow of desire for her in my mind. She's simply ravishing. That face, those wonderful, though somewhat sagging breasts, her thick thighs, her scraggly hair, her lips awash in honey, her pubic hairs, her armpits. I definitely can't live without them, especially the armpits. I've known many yonis, vaginas, but I can assure you that there's none like hers, which is radiant and tremulous as an open lotus. Samujjwala pankaja vibramanuna vilasa peshala manohara yoni. I'm going to skip the rest of this long detail. Also, another good quality, she never asked for the kind of gifts that other whores always want. I want you, fine poet that you are, to describe me and her very beautifully. That's what he said to me, with obvious affection, laying it on a little thick. That's what the poet says. Okay, now, that's the introductory section. The frame, standard frame of a Telugu Kavya, medieval Kavya, you can see, has been completely, turned inside out. So now the poet begins to speak in his own voice. He says, you, Mr. Blue Mountain, you sent priests luminous with knowledge to act as servants to your family. And those rich endowments of Sadhu Jayanti Mahadeva, you handed them over to your favorite whore. This is supposed to be in praise of the king. You drove out the tenant landlords, the Mirasidars in Rayavaram, and used their homes as your stables. You made your own younger brother, a man of good character, unemployed. You commissioned a big ritual performed by Venkata Shastri in Boyagolam without spending a single penny of your own money. Now I, for my part, will sing you a long poem that will suit you to perfection. So you have to notice this sort of concrete, very realistic detail and the ironic promise at the end of the verse. What follows, simply stated, is the story of how Blue Mountain King got the great Sanskrit poet Venkata Shastri, the anti-hero of the poem, to pimp for him, and how, after the usual intense periods of longing and pining and separation, viraha, the king and Sliver of the Moon finally made love. Because of the time constraint, I'm going to have to move rather quickly toward that final magnificent prose passage, just touching en passant on a verse or two along the way. But first, there is something more to be said about what we have just read. So, as you can see, it follows the stereotypical convention of a Telugu avatarika introduction. Always one meets the patron as he holds court. Well, he's usually surrounded by scholars and poets and generals and priests. And it is this patron who then commissions the poet to compose his book. But look what has happened to the scenario. The glorious patron has his head in his concubine's lap. Drunken hunters and soldiers are milling around him as dancing girls, pockmarked by herpes or other sexually transmitted disease, are performing with one eye on the king, who isn't paying any attention to them, and the other eye on the servants whose job is to arrange their daily or nightly rendezvous. Compared to the standard courtly scene, this one rings true, especially to anyone who has seen the rather grimy audience chambers that still exist in the crumbling remnants of these lime and plaster palaces. They're all over coastal Andhra. And yet we can say with certainty that these same pretentious palaces were sites that generated great Telugu and Sanskrit poetry and works of erudition, mostly forgotten today. One of my own quixotic goals in life is to recover as much as of that scintillating literature as I can, and to make it known again. And it's an uphill struggle. But there's something more. The vision offered in our text is clearly parodic in the classic sense of the word, that is, parody, an utterance that is simultaneously committed to two polarized semantic vectors, or two opposed poles, one a normative level, or a normative ideal, and the other subverting and lampooning that same ideal. There are people in this room who've heard me say this sentence more than once. I apologize to you. I won't repeat it in the course of what remains of the lecture. But the point is that the whole power of parody emerges from the tensile relation between these two poles. Here, however, parody, even savage parody, is, I think, too bland and generic a term. We can do better. I'll come back to this. And similarly, there's a problem with the word realism, which I've used a few times already. Candrarekha's Lament is certainly realistic in the way that Auerbach has shown to be true of late Latin comedy. Comedy demands a hypertrophied realism, focused on everything low, devalued, common in the pejorative sense, everything overly familiar, also grotesque. But we need to keep in mind, in coming to characterize the early modern Telugu prabandhams, that realism is always and necessarily a form of fiction, and that it is also always strongly configured. Indeed, it may be identified with a particular foundational figure, such as swabhavokti, naturalistic description in Indian poetics. That's the very first of the figures that the great poetician Dandin lists in his list of all poetic ornaments. But if our text is seen as a whole, as a kind of extended, obscenely realistic swabhavokti, then we need to redefine this figure and to historicize its evolution. It's one thing for a poet to describe the smell of the dust raised by the hooves of cows heading home to the village at evening, the Godhuli Lagna, or a rustic campfire where women are cooking dinner, as in the verses of Abhinanda. And quite another thing for a poet to describe intimate scenes of lovemaking in the bordello in the colloquial speech appropriate to that setting. And in this context, I want to note, following a remark by Velcheru Narayanarao, that in our text, conventional, highly positive descriptions of women's bodies tend to be in Sanskrit compounds that are basically cliches, while negative and boldly true-to-life details of bodies, male and female, are in everyday Telugu, a register mostly new to Telugu poetry. There'll be more on this in just a moment. You could regard this lecture as a kind of initial contribution to a new history of Swabhavokti. I hope someday to write that study. Okay, maybe you'd like to hear a little more detailed description of the heroine, the young whore Candrarekha, who arrives with her mother, the fat, aging, usually drunk, greedy, and foul-mouthed Venkatasani, at that ritual that we've already heard about. So Blue Mountain King has initiated this ritual event. He is there. And this is the moment when Desire, shooting his invisible arrows, strikes straight into the heart of Blue Mountain King and Sliver of Moon. And this moment gets a precise, relentless, sustained narrative. Rather modern in tone, if I may say so. Here it is. So this is Sliver. She was really pretty. Her teeth, uneven and discolored, were like seeds of squash stuck in shit. Flowers in her hair, like worms wiggling in dung. And her eyes, her striking eyes, squinting a little and sticky with pus, like the slime on the back of a frog. Like gourds growing beside a well, breasts bent down to her belly button. A figure like a haystack. Arms thick as pitchforks, thick hair all over her body. That's the girl who came to see her father's public ritual. So her father, that's her adoptive father, that's that same Sanskrit poet Venkata Shastri, Jagakavi's nemesis. He seems to be everywhere. There's something to be said about the way the prosody of this verse works. It's a slightly technical thing. I'm going to put it aside in the interest of saving time. All I can say is that there are classical precedents on that level alone, on the level of metrical effects. So the poet is using these classical forms to perfection, but with semantic contents utterly unlike any possible precedent. And I spoke about realism. So look what happens. Blue Mountain King sees the girl, and he says, "What a woman! That long braid adorned with dark tassels, that thick neck, fleshy, full-bodied waist, and all that hair, those long thighs covered in coal black skin. The face, kind of smoky, looking rather simian. Her shallow navel, her breasts like those minute oil lamps, her whole body soft as a thorn bush, her mouth oozing ambrosia, eyes like a crow's, or maybe like a cat's, a voice like a donkey's, her house of desire like a frying pan sticky with oil. I've never seen any woman like her. I have to make love to her, and soon. I can't bear this new passion." Okay. I just want to say, this is not Jagakavi. I think that there's something wonderful about this, because I think that people generally do not fall in love with other people who happen to conform to the standard criteria of beauty. They fall in love for other reasons. We all know this. Love, and I'm using this word on purpose because the Blue Mountain King is about to use it, is actually not about perfect bodily charms. How it actually works is a mystery. And here, in this deliberately exaggerated antinomian work, that mystery is celebrated. So listen to what the king says next. He's talking to the poet. "I've shagged 10,000 young whores and satisfied them, and rather a lot of young guys, too. A lot of those Dasi girls I even got without paying a penny. Remember, I told you he's a cheapskate. But I've never felt such strong love, Prema, for any woman. And no woman has ever seemed so beautiful to me. Did someone secretly put a love portion in my drink?" The use of that word Prema, that's the diagnostic feature of Telugu Kavya in this early modern period. Prema is differentiated from the standard romantic idiom of Sringara, or of, simple desire. And here it is in this particular book. King is feeling love, and fortunately for him, Sliver reciprocates his feeling. Here she uses the word anuragamu. Actually, it's love at first sight for her too. She notices that he's shaved off his mustache and beard. He looks, she says, like a man playing female roles in the Bhagavatamu performances. He's dressed with a turban like a Muslim. He wears Gujarati earrings, He has smeared sandal paste all over his body, so he looks like a water buffalo that's fallen into a muddy ditch. How romantic can you get? He looks like this water buffalo, and he wants me. He's like someone possessed by a demon. A love potion would be an excellent idea. He'll follow me like a servant, and I'll take all his money. She's, after all, a Vaishya. That's the end of the first canto. Second canto, most of it is given over to a long sermon by the girl's mother. This is a set piece. The girl's mother, she's the stereotypical Vaishya Mata, the mother, the madame of the bordello. And she wants to make sure that her girl does not actually feel anything like love for this potentially new client. Because the courtesan caste has strict rules. She should seduce him, this is the mother's teaching, she should seduce him with all the wiles at her disposal, but keep an inner distance from him. She should be like a kumbara purugu, the worm in a pot that bores silently through the clay. And it wouldn't be surprising if he's infected with venereal disease, and if he infects her, her life will be ruined, and so on. All this in a very familiar style, going back to books like the Kashmiri Kuttanimatam, to mention but one. But this is the fascinating thing. The girl, this is unusual, the girl won't have any of it. She says to her mother, "You're wasting your words, Mom. My heart is completely stuck on him. That's not going to change. What use is money? He's my big husband." And that's the truth. She offers a rather beautiful paronomastic verse. Yeah, I think I have time to read this to you. I'm keep my eye on the clock. This is a Shlesha verse with two registers of meaning for the same syllabic sequence. A mother like you, this is the young Sliver speaking to her mother. A mother like you is like a poem concocted by a lousy poet. You pay no attention to the subtleties of color and form, or to short syllables and long syllables, Laghu Varna and Guru Varna. You collect cash, Sarasapadautamulu, or juicy topics. But you have no compunction at all about ruining a person's life, or about ruining the meter, Vrittabhangamu. You don't take his friends and family seriously, and you can't scan a metrical foot. You're not interested in the bad things people say about you, or improper words, apashabda. And people can quarrel, or make up, or even die for all you care, or you can't combine words with proper sandhi. Sandhi vigraha pranahani vichara paratadakti. You don't understand moods and emotions, bhava. You don't hang out with scholars. You shoo away sages and ascetics, or you make a mess of the Sisuras, yatulu. You're at ease only with idiots. You call this real life, or a real poem? Anyway, our heroine, Sliver of Moon, is desperately in love, and everyone around her thinks she's sick in mind and body. She's burning with desire. So her girlfriends do what the girlfriends of the heroine always do in Telugu Kavya. That is, they try to cool her off with the normal refrigerants, such as sandal paste on her body. They make her lie down on moonstones, which are supposedly very cool. They melt at the touch of the moon rays, and moonlight itself is supposed to be very, very cooling. Except that it always only exacerbates the heat, of course. But in this case, none of those things happen. Instead, her girlfriend sprinkles salt in her vagina, put poisonous leaves on her breasts, the acrid, milky sap from the arca plant in her eyes to blind her, mustard in her nostrils, hot oil in her ears, lemon juice on her intimate organs. So by now, that parodic mode has taken over again, and with a vengeance. You can see the poet has exploded the standard love scenario by recycling its form without the slightest trace of the classical contents. Luckily, even her mother thinks that these measures are too extreme, and she informs the stepfather, Venkata Shastri, who intervenes. He gives the young girl buttermilk and rice and opium, and he assures her that Blue Mountain King will come to her. And you remember, he has a monetary interest in that good ending. Just in passing, you might think, remember I told you that this Blue Mountain King was supposedly present at the court at the first public recitation of this work. So you might kind of wonder what he was feeling, or what he was supposed to feel. He was at his brother-in-law's court. Was he squirming in his seat, but afraid to leave because of the Hyderabad ruler's command? Or, more interestingly, could it be that Blue Mountain King actually enjoyed these verses, celebrating his love for Sliver? Maybe the poet knew what his patron really wanted. So I want you to keep that thought in mind as we come to the end. I'm going to quickly go through the third canto. It opens with a scene in which Sliver's girlfriends are searching for the absent beloved in the forest, asking the birds and the trees and the ponds if they've seen him. And when he is finally discovered sleeping on the ground, he's treated to a poetic wake-up call, a suprabhatam, by his bards and courtiers. Wake up, your brother-in-law is summoning you. The tribal hunters have killed a pig and sent the meat to us, along with fresh hunting dogs. Get up, it's an emergency. A woman is waiting for you to make love to her. That's a true emergency. Finally, they managed to wake him up by putting garlic in his ears. So I promised you a bit of that final passage. It's this long prose passage. We've come to the moment. I'm not sure it could actually even be translated. A lot of it is onomatopoeic. And the syntax is, if I may say so, Joycean. And some of it simply too obscene for the English language, which does not have the resources that Telugu has. Narayana Rao used to say, for years Narayana Rao used to say that it's impossible, must be impossible to make love in English, it just doesn't have the vocabulary. But anyway, I'm going to give you a snippet of it. I'm doing my best. And I want you to listen. I mean, you'll hear the contents. But I want you to listen for the music of it. This is a form of early, modern Telugu literary prose. Now it's time, he thought, as he was drinking, or rather gulping down honey from her lips, embracing her gently, with subtlety, filling himself with her as she was looking at him with wide eyes, shiny and wet. He kissed her cheeks that were glowing like tiny lamps, caressed her hair that was fuzzy and frizzy and furry like a sheep's, kissed her eyes that were like the bumps on a frog, put his hand on her little tummy, touched her breasts that were like an inflated bellows made from animal skin, held her nails, long as a heron's neck, entered her. She was giddy. They were awash in a flood, shimmering like mercury. All kinds of foul words came out, like donkeys braying. They were both crying and melting. It was the first time. She's a Vaishya, remember. It's always the first time. It was the first time. They were equal in passion, awkward, sometimes scared, not holding back. Where are you going? Stop, don't talk. These are my gifts to you. Who said that? Everything was fruitful and immediate. They were spinning like gypsy acrobats who can revolve in the air around a wooden pole fixed to their navel. That's a trope that exists to this day in Andhra. Body pressed into body, no longer trembling or shy. They were holding on for dear life, pushing upwards, losing their grip, chattering and moaning, kurukumanukumu. Like young weavers rapidly working a loom, they were sniffing each other like water buffaloes or dogs, or cows and bulls, or hens and roosters, or other birds, or snakes at twilight. Their bed was a river in spate, or many rivulets flowing together, overflowing unchecked. It was a maha maituna sankalpa sambhoga krida vinoda, an ecstasy of mutual pleasure flowing through the imagining mind. And then finally they were tired. Thigh pressed to thigh, arm to arm, lip to lip, face to face, feet to feet, breast to breast, yoni to linga, an embrace that became a long, deep, eyeless sleep. So those of you who know Kalidasa's Meghaduta, the cloud messenger, you'll hear the intertextual presence in that final sentence of the famous verse at the end, Angain Angam Pratunatanuna Agadataptena Taptam. And like that, there's a verse from Pedana's Manucharitramu, a very famous, beautiful verse, the first time that the heroine Varutini makes love to the hero Pravara. These are there. And there's the mix of the standard and non-standard or far from standard features, also in the language. Also, interestingly, a remarkable sensitivity to and interest in a woman's sexual experience as imagined, of course, by a man. And that's how the book ends. Blue Mountain King is a big house built for Sliver of Moon in the village of Rayavaram, and he tells her to stay there and not go anywhere else, and he too will be there with her. And Venkata Shastri, the poet's rival, in effect the king's pimp, expresses his satisfaction at this arrangement. And now the poet can take leave with a final boast. So the last lines of the text. I have sung this story about you, O king, and your Candrarekha, in comic tones, beyond what words can say, so that it may last as long as the sun and the moon. Know that there are no other poets in the world who could have composed such a book. As long as the earth lasts, and the clouds, the stars, the sun, the elephants and the mountains, and the great snake who bear this earth, and the boar and the tortoise, as long as they're all still there, this Prabandha of mine will win the praise of poets who have good taste. O king, you who are a hurricane to those who come like clouds in supplication, you inveterate lover of lowly whores, you gambler with dice, you luckless god, nirbhagya damodara. What a way to end the poem. You luckless god. If I may, I'm going to take 5 minutes to conclude this meditation. I have 5 minutes? Okay. Okay, so what are we to make of this? This Bhutu Kavya is part Ninda Stuti, praise through blame, part extended lyrical curse, part sheer pornography, part bitter satire, part bittersweet parody. Or considering the ending I've just read and the self-conscious toying with the conventions at every step, maybe it's actually a self-parody or a parody of a parody, a second-order parody. And then one might suppose a positive effort to compose a playful yet hyper-realistic experimental text. But I think if we're going to try to understand more deeply both this work and its place in the cultural ecology of its time, we need to suspend this too easily accessible term parody, which I've been using with abandon, and realism too. Let's put it aside for now. And we're going to have to rethink what this kind of intensely reflexive, sophisticated, strongly hybrid, yet thoroughly integrated text is trying to do. And we may have to invent a new descriptive term, because Candrarekha's Lament, apparently unique, it is also the natural culmination of an entire literary moment throughout the Telugu and Tamil domains, probably also in the Kannada and Malayalam regions in early modern times. There's a relationship, by the way, between the diction and the language of the Tamil and Telugu padams, the dance pieces, that we can still see danced on the stage in Madras, although they're always explained away as being some kind of allegory for spiritual experience. So there's something to be said about the language and the style. My colleague Ramchandra Reddy has said the first thing one notices when reading Jagakavi is his tremendous command of Telugu, his Shabda Shakti. He's in full command of poetic Telugu, and the book as a whole is an extravaganza of lyrical narrative and description. And at the same time, this extraordinary poetic Telugu has absorbed the language of the street, or maybe the gutter. There's an amazing lexical richness, with the juicy character of the colloquial Telugu that you can still hear today spoken in the Godavari Delta, which has now somehow found a natural place within the courtly classical style. So was the book embarrassing to its hero? Maybe it was, but it rather looks, well, there are those final verses. You inveterate lover of lowly whores, you luckless god. But it's also crossed my mind that these hard-hitting curses might serve some apotropaic function, deflecting bad luck and compensating to some extent for this little king's delusional grandiosity. Or perhaps the text was intended to prop up that grandiosity by coloring it with new, earthy, utterly human colors, to save it from its own inflated rhetorical excess, or to put that excess to a new purpose. But one thing is certain: what begins as an apparent exercise in ridicule, indeed as revenge for the king's refusal to pay the poet's fee, ends happily with lovemaking that is, the poet says, finally, beyond what words can say, and with something approximating a marriage, because these courtesan relationships were indeed normally long-term relations, And the deflowering of a young apprentice courtesan was an auspicious ritual occasion, a celebration. I think the tone of that final chapter captures something of that celebratory note. So, just another paragraph and I'll stop. It's clear that the work is meant to be funny, and almost certainly shocking for its first audiences, not to mention the colonial censors. But funny in what ways? There's the cognitive dissonance generated by the amalgamation of high and low speech levels, along with this bold pairing of obscenity and passionate love in the new literary idiom of that time, almost 300 years ago. The courtly salons of these miniature kinglets were usually arenas for works of mockery, ridicule, reflexive self-deflation or self-denigration, luxuriant ironies that have yet to be studied and defined. I'm relying on Talia Ariav, formerly our student in Jerusalem, now your student here in Chicago, to give us some deeper understanding of those kinds of luxuriant ironies. I'd even go so far as to say that ironic portraits, including self-portraits, were the dominant mode in the spectrum of literary and musical genres of 18th century South India. Part of the huge damage the colonial period produced in the living performance traditions of South Indian art came not merely from a misplaced puritanical aversion to the erotic per se, but also from an abject failure to identify irony and subtlety when scholars encountered them in works like ours. What can I say? One has to know how to read, how to hear the overtones, how to savor the intentional dissonance and the radical themes, cloaked at times in a seemingly familiar or conventional form. Jagakavi was innovative beyond even the prevalent mocking modes and genres of late courtly Telugu, but he also marks the natural evolution of a literary culture that had turned back upon itself in order simultaneously to affirm and to demolish its own premises. That turning back deserves a name, if only to allow us to begin to examine the whole range of such works in all the major South Indian languages, and parody won't do. What about the adjective subversive, which I used once or twice? It's too accessible and actually facile, especially because this book, like so many of these works, seems to be aimed not at subversion, but at the transmutation of ridicule into a rich, higher, fuller order of aesthetic beauty of a special kind, one that is generated by incongruous mixtures, an intensity of earthy bodily feelings, and the invention of a playful style, perhaps a whole language commensurate with this new expressive mode. And since that turning back upon itself is still there, still a primary feature of this mode, I suggest that we think not of subversion, but of its opposite, which I guess would be supraversion, a turning over or upward or above. I know the word may take some getting used to. I only wish Steve Collins was here tonight to challenge me on this particular choice of words. And there are possible South Indian terms for what I'm getting at. This idea of a supraversive curse. Let me just say in conclusion that we may want to think about words that are intimately ironic or ironically intimate, at once endearing and excoriating, profoundly familiar and at the same time strange and utterly new, marvels of daring and insight that celebrate something surprising, like real love, or more than real love, rooted in the body-mind of a quite ordinary and rather silly, vain little king for a dumpy village courtesan still learning the ropes who loves him back. And suddenly this is a topic eminently suited for poetry, for true literature. That's the point. Something in the ecology of modes and forms has changed. Jagakavi was right to claim in his colophon that he was a Navina Shabda Shasana, a newfangled inventor of the science of sounds, a grammarian of an as yet barely existing artistic language, and that he was also just what the Hyderabadi Nizam is said to have called him, Bibadal, beyond compare. He has given us a highly personal work that is also beyond compare. I hope that the still rather tentative exploration of that work can serve as a very small Guru Dakshina a gift to my teacher, Wendy, by far the most generous human being I have ever known. Thank you, Wendy.
It's an occasion for aesthetic melancholy that this had to come to an end, and it's a crime against intellectual life that there's no time for questions. I can only thank you for this gift to Wendy and to us, and invite you all downstairs to the common room for some more words and some more gifts. Thank you.